Well, it is my honor today to talk with Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky taught at MIT for 50 years and is now a professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona. He is also one of the most cited living scholars in the social sciences, author of more than 100 books, and a tireless activist who has been involved with causes ranging from resistance to the Vietnam War, involvement in the civil rights movement, support for Sandinista Nicaragua while it was under siege by Reagan in the 80s, opposition to nuclear arms development, and many others. He's an illustrious member of the newly formed Progressive International. Noam, I thank you for your tireless struggle for justice and truth. It is my pleasure to talk with you today.
Delighted to be with you.
It is an honor, but also a daunting challenge to have you, of all people, as my first guest. To be honest, Noam, I do not feel prepared enough to do this. And I feel like the same feeling stops many from having opinions on politics, economics, and society at large. I have realized, however, that it is through action and participation, which in turn spark interest, that true learning happens, like you have said countless times. What would you say to a person who doesn't feel prepared enough to participate in politics about the value of his or her contribution and the rewards of participation and struggle?
There's nobody who's not prepared. Anyone who's aware of, even minimally aware of what's happening in the world around them, locally, globally, can at once become engaged in learning more, joining with others, acting to deal with the kinds of problems that many of them utter urgent, others waiting in the background to be dealt with. So I think anyone can plunge in, teenage kids,
Hmm.
anybody.
You often mention the influence of your uncle, and I mean the uncle from the newsstand, the influence that he had on you. You say that he was truly educated, yet he didn't go to university. You also criticize what you call, rightly, in my opinion, the intellectual commissars in your work, people such as Thomas Friedman from the New York Times. What would you say is the difference if we compare your uncle's education to that of the commissars?
Actually, my uncle never went past fourth grade, but he was one of the most educated people I've ever seen. Self-educated, read very widely, involved in all sorts of political organizations. He actually became, he ran a newsstand. He was disabled, so under the New Deal, he was able to get a, be able to, given the opportunity to run a newsstand. And there his newsstand was one of the liveliest places in New York, 1930s, lots of emigres, people surrounding it, interesting discussions. Among other things, he met uh, psychiatrists and psychoanalysts from the emigration, the great emigration from Germany as people were fleeing. He was interested in psychoanalysis. He read very widely. I won't go through the whole story, but he ended up as a very successful lay analyst living in a Riverside Drive apartment, and very successful. One of his patients became the head of one of the major psychiatric hospitals, sent patients to him. Never went past fourth grade. He had been in, he had been through every possible political formation. There were dozens of them at the time, very lively, and I learned a lot from him about those things and many others. The which called, I think correctly, the commissar class picks up an ideology, keeps to it. Doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. Can't ask questions 1 millimeter outside it, and anything that doesn't conform to the ideology is what's consigned to what uh, what are sometimes called the wild men in the wings. That's McGeorge Bundy's characterization of McGeorge Bundy was National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, former dean of Harvard, noted scholar. The wild men in the wings, he said, this is in 1968, the peak of the anti-war movement. The wild men in the wings were those who not only questioned the tactics of the government, but actually went on to question their motives. How can anyone dare to do that? If you do that, you're a wild man in the wings. In Stalinist Russia, if you did that, you were dissident,
Right. So basically, your uncle didn't have to go through any institutional filters. He was quite free to think whatever he wanted in his newsstand.
We can go through the institutional filters, learn a lot, break out, criticize them, analyze them, and become wild men in the wings. It's an option.
Right. Howard Zinn would be an example of that, and yourself.
He paid for it. He was thrown out of his first university position, Black College, Spelman College in Atlanta, because he supported the young Black activists during the civil rights movement. So he was thrown out. Went to Boston University, where the president, John Silber, was a really bitter autocrat, considered a liberal, incidentally, but
whom you debated, right, on the issue of Nicaragua. You're famous. He was quite obnoxious in that debate. I can remember that.
Well, Silber was determined to force Zinn out of the university. He was the most popular lecturer on campus, very active, does wonderful work. But so it finally got to the point where Silber ordered the political science department, his department. He said, if you don't get rid of him, you're not going to get 1 penny from the administration, even for paper clips. So finally, Howard resigned.
Right. Well, let's move on now. I would like to paraphrase a friend of yours and someone you have influenced. I say paraphrase because I heard this phrase in a podcast. I'm referring to Michael Albert. Michael Albert once said something along the lines of, to rebuild the left, we need 3 things. The first is to have a good analysis of reality and its injustices. The second is to develop a vision, to formulate a coherent proposal of what the future society we aim to build would look like. The third is strategy, that is, a roadmap of how to get from our current situation to the vision we aspire to. He then said that the left had lost the last 2. The mass popular movements we have seen all over the world, from the environmental movements to BLM to the uprising in Chile, have lighted a spark of hope in the hearts and minds of many. The Progressive International, of which you're a member, surely aims to give progressive movements both a vision and a strategy for the future. Could you give us an approximation of what those 2 may be?
Of the vision, I'm sorry, of the 2 what?
The vision for the future and the strategy, the road to get there.
Well, Mike Albert is an old friend for 60 years. We've worked together on many things. We've occasionally disagreed. One of the things we disagree about is how precise the vision of the future ought to be. There are many views about this. I mean, at one extreme, you have people like Karl Marx, who said nothing about it. Literally, you look through all of his work, there's scattered sentences here or there about what a post-capitalist society might be like. His reason was that he felt that after the working class had freed themselves from the fetters of capitalist autocracy, they would take up the challenge and determine how the future should look. That's one extreme. Mike is pretty much at the other extreme. He's suggested, provided very interesting ideas, is Paracon, participatory economics, about what a detailed structure of a future society should be like. Personally, I'm sort of in the middle. I think Marx didn't go far enough, but I feel we don't understand enough to give a specific version of the way the future ought to be organized. I feel that we have good guidelines. We can take steps towards implementing them. I expect we'll learn on the way. As far as the Progressive International is concerned, it's a collection of different individuals. It hasn't taken a specific stand on what the vision of the future would be, but my guess would be that the most engaged members of it would also be somewhere in the middle. There are things we can achieve, there are things we must achieve, there are directions we would like to pursue. We can begin working on them now, building the institutions of the future in the present society, but sketching a precise version of the vision of the future, I suspect, guessing most of them would agree, is premature. We just don't know enough about social organization. So you can try many things, see which ones work, and can be quite concrete. So, for example, developing worker-owned industries is a step towards building the institutions of the future. You can do that right now. In fact, it is being done substantially. We have urgent problems which have to be dealt with in the next decade or two, or it's all finished. Can't overlook that. If we don't deal with the environmental crisis, we're done. We let it go another 20 years or so, we're probably past irreversible tipping points. So everything's over. Can't put that aside. If we don't control nuclear weapons, we can be destroyed at any moment. Okay. Take the pandemic, which right now is everyone's concern for obvious reasons. There are ways to deal with it. There are ways to make it monstrous. We see all of them in front of us. At one extreme, we see countries like Vietnam, Senegal, New Zealand, South Korea, which have controlled it. We have other countries like the United States, India, Brazil, where it's raging out of control. It's not in the genes, it's in the policies. So obvious that the New England Journal of Medicine, the main journal of medicine in the United States, one of the main in the world, it's been around for 2 centuries. It's never taken a position on an election. They just came out for the first time with a very strong editorial saying we have to get rid of the Washington contingent because of their incompetence, rejection of science, malevolence. If we don't do it, we're finished. Okay? These are urgent problems. Then there are long run problems, like should the job contract exist? I don't think it should. It's a form of tyranny that shouldn't exist. And we can work on that right now, building up pieces of a future in which it doesn't exist, like worker-owned and managed enterprises. And there are many other possibilities. Cooperatives, localism, mutual aid groups in communities, plenty of things that can be done to work for a more better future. Things like take the Green New Deal. It's not just aimed at ending the use of fossil fuels, though that's critical. It's also aimed at building a very different world. Different kind of jobs, maybe no jobs, maybe socialized enterprises, build the kinds of structures that will benefit people rather than harm them all over the economy, all over the society. All of these things can be done at once. Mike feels, you can argue the point that we really need a much more detailed vision of the future. He's got arguments, he's got good ideas. I think it goes too far myself.
Speaking, I mean, I was planning to ask another question, but another just came to mind. speaking of the Green New Deal, it never fails to amaze me with the Green New Deal and with Medicare for All and many other policies that may very well be taken in America, because your country, well, as you have called it many times, is the richest nation to have ever existed. And indeed, it shows that with its constant support for the military industrial complex. Yet, if you ask many Americans, they regard such policies as unreal or too expensive, terms that are never ever applied to the military industrial complex. In fact, I just read a couple of weeks ago, I think, that the Pentagon received a certain amount of money as a COVID relief fund, and they gave a substantial portion of it to contractors, money that they should have spent taking care of, of healthcare and COVID related concerns. Um, so it seems to be a matter of subjective cultural horizons. So how can it be? Let me put it this way: I have always been astounded by how wars can mobilize so many human resources and material resources for a terrible cause, but at an amazing scale. World War II is a great example of this. Why cannot we ever think in the same terms that we thought of, as in the case of World War II, but for a Green New Deal or for other such policies that would help millions?
Well, let's go through your examples. Take Medicare for all. Who is it who says it's too expensive? Not the population.
Hmm.
Population's in favor of it. The business world, the insurance companies, the media, the commissar class, they say it's too expensive. Now, let's ask a simple question. You're in Argentina, correct?
Hmm.
You have universal health care.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any country that doesn't have it?
Well, I know about the United States and a few others, but most of the
You have to
certainly
look
most of
pretty
the
hard.
developed world. And
The entire world has it. All the rich countries, all the poor countries. Is it costing them more than the United States? It's costing them half as much as the United States. US healthcare costs are about twice those of the OECD countries, the richer countries, the comparable ones. What's the difference? In the United States, the costs go into the pockets of the insurance, of the health, of the insurance industry and the financial institutions. So according to the ideology, that's not a cost. Okay. It's called a cost when it goes to taxes.
hmm,
So if you pay half as much in taxes as you're paying for your health care, it's too expensive.
hmm,
Now that's an ideological principle. You have to, it's the kind of thing that Marx and Gramsci and others talked about. You have to create an ideological system in which which reflects class interests and in which even the most grotesque absurdity becomes just common belief that people don't question. So yes, there's a debate about how can we possibly pay for it, when the fact of the matter is paying for it would be about half of what we pay now. But it would be payment, but the attitude towards taxes in a country is a very good measure of the level of democracy. If you had a pure democracy, really perfectly functioning, Mike Albert's kind of democracy, people get together, they deliberate, they decide what they want for their community, for the world, they decide how to fund it. Then the day comes along when they fund it. It's a day of celebration. That's tax day celebration. We're doing what we want. That's one extreme. Go to a pure totalitarian state. The, the, the maximal leader says, here's what you're going to pay. So you pay the money and you hate it. And tax day is a day of mourning. Where's the United States? Tax day is a day of mourning. Tells you something about the nature of the democracy. You can ask the same question about Argentina.
I
It's
was I actually wanted to ask you a question about that, because right now there are two things going on. First of all, obviously, we are under a severe economic crisis that we inherited from Macri, and which has now been radically worsened by the COVID crisis. And lots of people are gaining a certain mood of anti-politics, such as it's the fault of politicians in general. No differences at all, and they complain about the tax burden, which they call really well, burdensome, to be repetitive, which I would agree in the case of the middle class and the lower classes. So I believe that in English you call it a value added tax, so a highly regressive tax that poor people and rich people pay all the same. Well, that was increased during the neoliberal reforms here. Of course, Macri increased the price of all services such as electricity and others. And however, our rich people, our top 1% or 10%, actually pay way less in taxes as compared to not just to Europe, but to other Latin American countries. So when people think about taxes, they think about taxes as a whole. Um,
Right.
and right now, and I'll close my question with this, there's a policy, a law being debated in our Congress to tax only one time our top 1%, the top 1% of society. I think it's something like 10,000 people. And the idea that the Conservative Party here is running is that this is attacking meritocracy. So we are attacking those who, through their hard work and intelligence, have gotten what they have. What do you have to say about this idea of meritocracy? Does anyone deserve to be a billionaire?
Well, the billionaires are ones who have succeeded through various devices, cheating, stealing, influencing influential people, luck, a couple of other things, and gaining lots of money. Okay. Is that merit? I mean, there's much more merit in a nurse in a hospital who's taking care of patients. It has nothing to do with merit. It has to do with particular ways, and often it's just inherited wealth proceeding. But it doesn't matter. Suppose it was merit. I mean, should the most meritorious people get the highest wages? Well, the most meritorious people are working people, people who work hard, who take, build create our lives, scientists in universities, and nurses in hospitals, people who are who are devoting themselves to the common good. Those are the meritorious people. Should they be billionaires? No, I don't think so. People should receive what they need and should produce what they're able to produce. That's the way a society should run. We shouldn't even be talking about meritocracy, ludicrous as the idea is. But it's not just the politicians. Yes, Argentina has been subjected, there's plenty of internal problems. It's also been subjected to the IMF rules, to vulture capitalists like Peter Singer, to judges in the United States who imposed ridiculous, shameful rules on payment of extortion, a whole series of things. But all through Latin America, there is a fundamental problem. Latin America, quite generally, the rich have felt no responsibility for the welfare of the society. It's very striking to compare Latin America with East Asia. Very striking comparison. You go back 50 years, let's say, 60 years. South Korea was at the level of an African country. Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world if you go back a century. What's happened? And the same is true. Latin America has massive resources, huge natural resources. East Asia has none. Latin America has no external enemies, doesn't fight wars against anyone except each other and its own population. Okay. East Asia is in a highly conflicted area. By any external measure, Latin America ought to be prosperous, booming. East Asia ought to be a wreck. It's exactly the opposite. One of the main reasons is the way East Asia, the governments have been controlling their elites. In Latin America, the elites are out of control. They don't pay taxes. They ship capital abroad. They buy fancy homes on the Riviera. They send their children to study at, Oxford and Harvard and so on. They don't pay attention to the society. It's not their business. And you can see it in things like imports. Imports to Latin America are mostly luxury goods for the rich. Imports to East Asia are capital goods to build the productive apparatus. Investment in East Asia is targeted. It has to go to places that will lead to development, and it has to transfer technology. It's Taiwan, South Korea, elsewhere. Investment in Latin America, robbery. When the economic guru for Bolsonaro, Paulo Guedes, his slogan explicitly is privatize everything. That means hand everything over to the rich and foreign investors, and there'll be nothing left of the country. Okay, that's Latin American elites. That's neoliberal ideology, incidentally. Privatize everything. Put it in the hands of unaccountable private tyrannies. Then everything will be wonderful. Well, when you have a difference like that, there's going to be problems. That's one fundamental problem in Latin America. There are many others, like the role of the military. I don't have to tell you what it's like in Argentina.
Okay. I know
But
pretty well. It's actually
where
quite.
did it come from? Where did it come from? A lot of it came from John F. Kennedy, who's admired in Latin America. In 1962, John F. Kennedy changed the mission of the Latin American military. Of course, the US can determine that. Changed the mission from hemispheric defense, which was a holdover from World War II, to internal security. What does internal security mean in Latin America? You know very well. It means unleash the military against your own population. That's internal security. It was followed very quickly by the military coup in Brazil, strongly supported by the United States, first of the neo-Nazi national security states, ran through the rest of the continent, through Chile, where Paulo Guedes got his economic education, finally in Argentina, the worst of all of them, strongly supported by the United States. Kissinger and Reagan loved it, the international. Okay, it's not happening in a vacuum. Latin America has to free itself from the tyrant in the north and from its own irresponsible elite elements. That's a major internal and external battle.
Hmm. Uh, I was actually planning to ask you something about the Kennedy doctrine. Um, I have been actually quite interested, and I read an article of yours called "Rollback" back from the 1990s that you wrote on basically the neoliberal assault. And one of the things that this article says, which is in line with many things I've been reading lately, is how basically neoliberal policies will cut back on pretty much every social services except for security, fight against drugs, and prisons. Well, actually, after our last dictatorship, and this happened in many Latin American countries, um, the military lost a lot of prestige. However, lately we've been seeing how police forces have become increasingly militarized with the excuse of fighting drug traffickers. Now, I've been studying the drug war, and it's truly, I cannot think of a policy that has failed more radically if we look at its intentions in terms of cutting back on addiction, let's say, or of terminating drug dealers, they only seem to pop up more, if anything, and we see more and more addicts. Conversely, we have seen how nations such as Portugal or Switzerland have taken different stances with the drug war and have been tremendously successful. So my question is the drug war simply an excuse to deal with what you call, I think, the surplus population, or some term like that you use?
Let's take the drug war. You may recall that a few years ago, I think it was 2012, there was a hemispheric conference. I think it met in uh, Cartagena, I think. Uh, there were two main issues that came up in the hemispheric conference. It could never reach a consensus on these two issues. One issue was allowing Cuba to enter the hemispheric system. Total agreement in the hemisphere except for the United States and Canada. The second was decriminalization of drugs. That's short of legalization. It's moving towards the Portugal style solution. Decriminalize them, get rid of the cartels, try to teach them like a public health issue the way it should be treated. Total agreement in the hemisphere with two exceptions, the United States and Canada. Okay. What is the source of the drug problem? Well, there are two things. There's demand and there's guns. Where's the demand? In the United States. Where are the guns? In the United States. You look at Mexico, where we have statistics on where the guns are coming from for the cartels, which are murderous and brutal. Most are coming from the United States. I live in Arizona, right north of the border. I don't know which end of a gun to shoot, frankly, but I could walk into a gun store, buy an assault rifle, hand it over to the Mexican cartel representative who'll pay me for it. Okay. The source of the problem is in the United States, secondarily Canada. The Latin American countries should move towards decriminalization. The United States has a fundamental problem, deep problem. Why are we criminalizing marijuana, for example? It's insane. It's less dangerous than the cup of coffee I'm now drinking. Okay, it's been understood by now. It's finally starting to break down, I should say. But across the board, the drug war was actually instituted by Richard Nixon. You have to give him credit. In his case, at least part of the expenses for the drug war were for prevention and treatment. By the time you get to Ronald Reagan, 10 years later, that was gone. No prevention and treatment, just harsh criminal penalties. End result, you got the prisons, state prisons, filled with drug offenses. It's also very racist. So you take a look at for the same so-called crime, blacks are much more heavily penalized than whites. The poor more than the rich. The rich are not penalized for smoking marijuana in their executive suites. Yeah. You don't do that. Okay. So it's class-based, race-based, shouldn't exist. It's one of the reasons why you go back to 1980, Reagan, US incarceration rates were approximately those of Europe, slightly higher on average. Now they're 5 times 10 times as high. Is that crime? No, it's not crime. It's what are called crimes. There were studies back in the 70s by the top analysts, Rand Corporation, quasi-governmental corporation, studying the effect of various kinds of approaches to the drug war. They found that the most cost-effective and the ones that cost least and achieved most were prevention and treatment. Next, lower than that, was police action, more expensive, less effective. Then the next lowest was border controls, still more expensive, still less effective. Worst of all, actions abroad, fumigation in Colombia, most expensive, least effective. Take a look at expenses, they're in the opposite order, not because of lack of information.
Right. No,
Now, Latin America can free itself from this. At the Cartagena conference, Latin American walked away and said, well, we can't do anything about the Colossus in the north. It can.
Noam, if I may, I will ask you one more question. If you have to go, I'll respect your time.
Yeah,
I
let's
can.
go.
Well, I'll simply end with this then. Right wing or anarcho capitalists, as they call themselves, like to talk about freedom a lot. They mention the word all the time. If you analyze what it means that the freedom to basically not care about anyone else and not care about the environment. What is your own definition of freedom coming from the left anarchist tradition?
Freedom includes not taking orders from higher authorities, illegitimate authorities. If you grant them the authority, you say, yes, you're representing me, and I'll call you back if you're not doing it. If you provide temporary authority to something, okay, that's fine. If you're in an institution where you have to spend your waking life following, almost all your waking life, following the orders of a totalitarian authority, that's not freedom. That's having a job. That's what we call having a job. You spend your waking life taking orders from a boss who has more control over you than Stalin had over Russians. Stalin couldn't tell you you can take a bathroom break at 3 o'clock for 5 minutes, or you can talk to this person, but not that person, or you can take this path from here to there in an Amazon warehouse, but not another path. These are the most totalitarian institutions that exist. Anarcho-capitalist wants everything to be like that. In fact, they're pretty frank about it. And take a look at one of their top gurus, James Buchanan, one of the most highly regarded anarcho-capitalist thinkers, Nobel Prize laureate. He says, every person's perfect situation, what we all aspire to, is to be the master of a world of slaves. If you haven't noticed, that's your highest aspiration. Okay, well, translate that into policy, you can see what you get. And it is policy. So when the neoliberal reaction, and it began with Reagan, it's not anarcho-capitalist, but it's heavily influenced by it. Their leading economic thinker was Milton Friedman, the chief economist of the neoliberal revolution, a libertarian, so-called libertarian thinker. He wrote a very influential article, which then became policy, which said the responsibility of a corporation is solely to enrich its shareholders and management, nothing else. That's what corporations must do. That's combined with the policy enunciated by neoliberalism that government is the problem, not the solution, meaning turn everything over to private corporate power whose sole responsibility is to enrich themselves. Does it take a genius to figure out what's going to happen from this? Well, no, it doesn't. Now we have some figures. The Rand Corporation, again, major, the most respected analysts, just came out with an analysis for the United States. You can generalize it for the world. For the United States during the neoliberal period, how much money has been transferred? I would say robbed. They're polite. They say transferred from the middle class and the working class to the very rich. $47 trillion. It's not small change. And it's an underestimate. Doesn't account for lots of other things. Okay? That's what happens when you say, take everything in the hands, out of the hands of government, which is partially responsive to the population, put it in the hands of private power, which the anarcho-capitalist wants, which has no responsibility to anyone except themselves. What do you think is going to happen? Okay, we've
Don't worry,
seen
no,
you've
we've
seen
had.
it in Argentina,
Hmm?
much worse than here. Seen it in many parts of the world. It's one of the reasons for the anger, resentment, contempt for institutions you see all over the world. Fertile territory for demagogues. Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi in India. People who say, I'm your savior, you follow me, blame somebody else, blame immigrants, blacks, China, blame anybody at hand, not the people who are doing it to you. That's pretty much what we see in the world around us. It's pretty serious. The Progressive International, to get back to that, is an attempt to organize the people of the world to struggle against these monstrosities. Will it work? We don't know. You can try.
We must try. Noam, it has been my pleasure and my honor to talk with you today. I have so many more questions that I would like to ask, but who knows? Maybe we can have I can ask them on some other occasion. For now, I can only thank you and wish you good health, sir.
Thank you very much. Good to
Have a
talk to
nice
you.
day, Noam. Thank you.